We'll begin Be'ezer Hashem the sugya of IKAR and Tafel, and the part of the sugya which Be'ezer Hashem will discuss in today's limud will be directly connected to what we discussed in the last limud in terms of the din of Dvarim Haboim B'Soicha Suda Machma Suda, how they are subsumed within the bracha of the Suda, and we will then return to clarify certain nekudas in that sugya which we left from the previous limud. Beginning with the basic din of IKAR and Tafel as it's brought in the Mishnah, Heviu lefonov moliach tchila upas imay. Rashi explains moliach kol dovar maluach. When pas is brought with it, the din is mevarach ala moliach upoiter es hapas. Taisus diber maschil mevarach ala moliach explains that the chiddush of the Mishnah is itztich lashmi'inon de pa'omim pas tofel. The chiddush of the Mishnah is that even pas itself, which is usually considered the most choshuv, and bracha la pas is poiter all other ma'acholim, like Taisus says, pas poiter es aparperes, itztich lashmi'inon de pa'omim pas tofel. The chiddush of the Mishnah is that there are times in which pas itself can be a tofel. The Gemara asks, "Umiya kimide de havi moliach ikir upas tfela." Where do we find that moliach is an ikir and pas is a tofel? On that, the Gemara answers, "Omer of Acha Breder of Ivya, Omer of Ashi, beoichle peiros ginoisar shom." We're talking about a case where the person ate peiros ginoisar, which the Rishonim say are peiros which are intensely sweet. In that case, the moliach is being eaten in order to offset the sweetness of the pas, and therefore the pas then becomes a tofel to the moliach, which is eaten together with the pas. That's what seemingly would be mashma from the Gemara. The Mishnah had said, "Heviu lefon of moliach tchilo pas imoy." The pas is tofel to the moliach. The Gemara then asked, what is the case in which moliach is ikar and the pas becomes the tofel? Ordinarily, the ikar achila would be the pas and the moliach would be the tofel. The Gemara answers that the moliach is being eaten because of peiros ginoisa. And this would be mashma in Taisus, diber masra ba'oichle peiros ginoisa shanu, where Taisus says, "Sham moliach ikir, shuhu bo lohoshiv haleiv shenechlash mipnei mesikos hapeiros." The Mishnah is illustrating a case where the moliach is ikir, because it's coming to offset the mesikos of the peiros, and the pas, which is then eaten to offset the moliach, is a tofel to the moliach. Ve'einoi bo elo b'shvil hamoliach. The way then Taisus presents the case of the Gemara is, the ikar achila is the peiros ginoisar, the moliach is being eaten l'tzorech hapeiros, the pas is being nechal l'tzorech hamoliach. In which case Taisus then asks, the imtoimar peiros have ikar, the sequence begins with the peiros which are the ikar, and the only reason why the moliach is being eaten is to offset the time of the peiros. So therefore moliach tofel. Why does the Mishnah say that the case is according to the way Taisus understands the maskon of the Gemara, that where the Gemara says that we're talking about oichle peiros ginoisa, the sequence begins with the achila of the peiros. That then necessitates the achila of moliach, which in turn necessitates the achila of pas. So Zok Taisus, Peiros have ikaru moliach tofel levarach ala peiros veliftar kule. Zok Taisus yeshloimer the mayri shelo ochal peiros ba'isay ma'imad yinami b'shosha ochal peiros ginoisar loihoy oshomadayin moliach upas. Taisus gives us two answers where the common svara of both answers is that the ukimta has to be in a case where mitzad the dinim of ikar and tofel, the peiros cannot be poiter the moliach. And Taisa says there's either one of two reasons for that. Either it's not ba'isay ma'imod, or because loher sham lefanav adayin. And those are two dinim in the dinim of ikar and tofel, which Be'ezer Hashem will learn in the Hemshech HaSugya, that these two instances of Taisus are exceptions to the din of where the ikar will be paid to the tofel, either because it wasn't ba'isay ma'imod or because it wasn't lefanav. But in summary, what Taisus has essentially said is that in a case where either it was ba'isay ma'imod and the moliach was befan, the peiros, the moliach was befanov, in that case where he ate the peiros, the brach of the peiros would be paid to the moliach, and by virtue of the moliach being included in the bracha on the peiros, the moliach would also then in turn be poiter the pas. This is mavur mitoich shitas hataisis. This chidush of Taisus is mentioned by the Mogen Avram in Siman Kuf Ayin Daled. We learned in the previous sugya of Dvarim Haboim B'Seich HaSuda that in the same way as pas is poiter everything that's brought as the ikar of the Suda, so hu adin, when one is shoyse yayin, the bracha of the yayin is poiter kol mine mashkim. This halacha is brought in Siman Kuf Ayin Daled in Sif Beis, yayin poiter kol mine mashkim. Yayin is poiter all mashkim from bracha rishayna, as the Ramah adds, afilu mi bracha rishayna. Now, in that same siman, in Siman Kuf Ayin Daled, in the end of Sifkat Tas, the Mogen Avram brings a din in the name of the Shiltei Giborim. Mogen Avram says, Kosav b'Shiltei Giborim, ha'anusi, anis, which is a certain type, which is a herb, she'oichlin achar asuda lematik hashtia, which is eaten after the suda in order to be mematik the shtia, in order to balance the taste of the shtia. Have kimoy tznoin v'zayis, that is like the case of tznoin and zayis, where the ikar is poit to the tofel, ubirchas hayayin poiteres, and the bracha of the yayin will pater the anusi, because the anusi is being eaten in order to offset the shtia of the yayin. This is a din which the Mogen Avram brings in the name of the Shiltei Giborim. Zokte Mogen Avram venirli. The Mogen Avram now carries the chiddush of the Shiltei Giborim a step further, and he says, "De b'shar mashkim toich suda." What happens if the shtia is not a shtia of yayin, which always has its own bracha, and therefore the bracha of the yayin, the Shiltei Giborim says, includes the anusi? But he says, what would be if the shar mashkim that were being consumed toich suda, birchas halechem poitrosam, in that case the bracha of the lechem patters them, and therefore zok the Mogen Avram, hamashke tofel alechem v'ha'anusi lamashke. What would be, says the Mogen Avram, in a case when one isn't being shoyse yayin, which would then require anusi, but for example, one's being oichal a suda, and during the suda one's being oichal a different kind of mashke. One's being shoyse a different kind of mashke, not necessarily yayin. And that mashke also requires anusi to be mimatic the shtia. So zog the Mogen Avram bishleima in the case of the Shiltei Giborim, when one has made a bracha on the yayin, so therefore the anusi, which is tofel to the yayin, is a tofel, and therefore included in the bracha of the yayin, and then anusi doesn't require its own bracha. But says the Mogen Avram, in a case of shar mashkim b'Seich HaSuda don't have their own bracha. Their bracha is included in the bracha of the pas. In this case, declared the Mogen Avram, can the anusi be also potter from bracha, like the Shiltei Giborim says, because the anusi is a tofel to the shar mashkim, and the shar mashkim are in turn a tofel to the pas. Seemingly, the suffix of the Magen Avraham is, and this is the way the later HaRav classify and refer to this suffix of the Magen Avraham, is there a din in Ikar and Tofel that a Tofel to a Tofel is also pater from bracha? Perhaps we only find the din of Ikar and Tofel in cases where we have one Ikar, and to that Ikar there is one Tofel. But where we have one Ikar, and to that there's a Tofel, and in turn there's a Tofel to the Tofel, perhaps there's not a din of Ikar poiter es atfela. The cases where we have are, like in the Mishnah, Moliach tchilu pas imoy mevarach ala moliach u poiter es apas. Moliach patas pas, like Tesa says, the chiddush is that even pas can be pater from Moliach. We have a case of Tznoin and Zayis, where we had in the earlier sugya, where one is a tofel to the other. We had a case of, in the Gemara on Daf Lamed Vav, where Shemen becomes a tofel to pas, or a Nigram becomes a tofel to Shemen, and so on, where in each case there is one Ikar and one tofel. But where we have one Ikar, and to that Ikar there's a tofel, and then to that tofel in turn there's another tofel, what would be the din benegea to being poiter the tofel to a tofel? So the Shilti Gibayim establishes that Anusi, which is to be mematik shtia, has a din of tofel. But that is only being established in the case where the tofel is a tofel to yayin, where the yayin has its own bracha, and then what's necessary to be mematik, the shtia of the yayin, is of course is a tofel. It's a tofel to a single ikar. Masha Enkein in the tzir of the Magen Avraham, Shar mashkim toichasuda, where birchas halechem poitrosam, where the mashke is tofel alechem, clear the Magen Avraham can nanusi be a tofel to the mashke. Zok the Magen Avraham k'moshe kosav ha-Tosfos. This chiddush that there could be a tofel to a tofel is the chiddush of Tosfos. Where do we see this in Tosfos? The keshabirich al peiris ginoisor potri lamoliach. Tosfos in his kasha assumes that in a case where Peres Ginoisa were being eaten, the Peres Ginoisa would allow the Maliach to be a tofel, and Tosfos then says the pas would be tofel. The hapas tofel ha-Maliach va-Maliach la-Peres. If you go back to Tosfos asked the kasha, why does the Mishnah say, hey viu lefon of Maliach tchilu pas, mevarach ala Maliach? The way Tosfos understood the terets of the Gemara, that ba'oichle Peres Ginoisa shonu, that the sequence begins, like we said, with the Peres Ginoisar. That necessitates a Moliach, which in turn necessitates pas. Frek Tosfos v'im toima Peres have a Iker, u'Moliach tofel, v'livarech ala Peres, v'liftar kulu. Zok the Magen Avraham, from the Tosfos in his kasha has made the assumption that when Moliach would be the Iker, in turn pas would be the I apologize. In the case where Peres Ginoisa would be the Iker, Moliach would be the Tofel. In turn, the Pas would be the Tofel to the Moliach. Tosfos says a brach on Peres Ginoisa would in turn allow the Pas itself to be included in the brach of the Peres. Zok the Magen Avraham, we see from Tosfos that a Tofel to a Tofel is pater from a bracha. And even after Tosfos says the two terutzim, we were medayik in Tosfos that Tosfos just answered two ukimtas that therefore preclude the possibility of using the din of Ikar and Tofel in order that the Peres Ginoisar should be the Ikar to the Maliach, which is a Tofel. But Mavur, even in the Tirutzim of Tosfos, that were the Peres Ginoisar to remain the Ikar, and the Maliach will be in turn a tofel to the Peres, then in the Chanami, the pas would be included within the din of the bracha of the Peres Ginoisar itself. Vais the Magen Avraham, there's a din of tofel to a tofel. Is this din of tofel to a tofel muskam in the Rishonim? So if we go back to the Gemara's kasha was mi ikimide dav moliach ikru pas tfeila. Where do we find that moliach is an ikr and pas is a tofel? To which the Gemara answered, as we said, Peres Ginoisar sham. The straightforward reading of the Gemara would seem to be, and that's the way it was Mavur and Taisus, as we've discussed, that the Peres Ginoisar necessitates the Achila of a Moliach, and in turn, the Moliach necessitates the Achila of Pas. In the Sefer Teres Chaim, from one of the Talmidei Chasim Sofer, in the Sefer Teres Chaim, the Baal Mechaber of the Sefer Teres Chaim is Rabbi Yaakov Shalom Sofer, who was of the son of Tshuvas Machne Chaim, of the Talmidei Chasim Sofer. So there in Siman Reish Yud Beis in Ois Gimel, the Teres Chaim is medayik already from Rashi, and in turn he'll show the same thing from Rabbeinu Yoina, that both Rashi and Rabbeinu Yoina are chelek in Tosfos, on chelek on Tosfos in the basic pshat in the Gemara, and based on that machloikes, we no longer see in the Gemara that the case is like Tosfos, in which case we have no makar for the chiddush of Tosfos that tofel to a tofel is also potter from a bracha. What steht in Rashi? On the teretz of the Gemara of Peres Ginoisa, Rashi says, Peres eretz yam kineres chashuvim min hapas. What steht in Rashi? Tosfos understood that when the Gemara says the ukim to Peres Ginoisar, it means Peres Ginoisar necessitates a moliach, which in turn necessitates pas. Zogt Rashi, when the Gemara answers Peres Ginoisar, the Gemara is saying that the pas is not tofel to the moliach, the pas is tofel to the Peres Ginoisar. The poiter of pas is the Peres, not the moliach. Memele Zogt Teres Chaim, we see from Rashi Adarabah that Rashi's chelek on Tosfos, that the moliach would not be able to be poiter the pas in and of itself, but the pas is only potter because of the Peres. So we have no makor anymore in the Gemaras of the Teres Chaim that tofel to a tofel is potter. So too, the Teres Chaim is medayik in what is mavur in Rabbeinu Yoina, where Rabbeinu Yoina on this Mishnah of Moliach and Pas. I apologize. Rabbeinu Yoina's lashon in the beginning after the Mishnah of Eviu Lefon of Moliach, Rabbeinu Yoina on Dibra Maschel Gemara, but Oichle Peres Ginoisar Shaminu. Pirush says Rabbeinu Yoina Peres Ginoisar he Mesukim B'Yoiser ve'Eino Me'echolim Ela im Melach Harbe. The Peres Ginoisar are eaten together with a substantial amount of melach. Kedesha Mesika lo Yazik Lohem. So the Mesika shouldn't be mazik. Va'oichlim oisam im hapas. And the Peres Ginoisa themselves are eaten together with pas. V'nimtza, says Rabbeinu Yoina, shehapas tfeilo el haperos. The pas is tofel to peros. Ulefikach mevarech al haperos upaiteres hapas. So Rabbeinu Yoina differs than Rashi. Rabbeinu Yoina doesn't require, as Rashi does, that the Peiros should be more choshuv than the pas. But Rabbeinu Yoina concurs with Rashi that the sequence of tefillos is not like Tosa says, that the Peiros are the IKAR, the Moliach is tofel to the Peiros, and the pas is tofel to the Moliach. Rabbeinu Yoina, like Rashi, says that the pas is tofel to the Peiros. Rashi says because they're muchashuv. Rabbeinu Yoina says because the pas is nechal together with the Peiros, which is nechal together with Moliach, but the pas is considered to be tofel directly to the Peiros. But Oifen zok the Teres Chaim, and he says that we see from both Rabbeinu Yoina and Rashi different to Tosfos. He says, "Dezeh chidush godol, de mevorech ala peiros upoiter hatofel loy dahainu hamaliach, v'gam poiter es hatofel hamaliach. Hagam, despite the fact shahapas einoi tofel hapeiros." Zot the Teres Chaim, v'ayin b'tamid Rabbeinu Yoina de kosvu, the Peiros ginoiser he mesukim beyoyse, the Lashon Rabbeinu Yoina we just saw. Ve'eino ne'cholim el hamelech harbe kedei shemasiko lo yazik lem, ve'oichlem im hapas, ve'nimtza shapas tfeila la Peiros, u'lefikoch mevarach ala Peiros u'poiter hapas. Nira midvarav, says the Teres Chaim, what we see from Rabbeinu Yoina, dimhoya hapas tofel hamelach, with the pas only to be tofel hamelach, in the way Tosfos understands, loy hoya poiter birchas haPeiros ala pas. Dirak hatofel loy poiter, veloy es hatofel la tofel loy. Therefore, continues the Teres Chaim, v'hamogen Avrom b'simen kuf ayin dalet tzivkot tes, the Mogen Avrom, which we learned before Pasak, b'shoise mashke toy chasuda, v'oichel ha'anusi lemate kashtiyo den tzarech levarech olav, the hamashke niftar b'birchas alechem, v'hanusi tofel hamashke, o kotesis anal, ulan yuzdaiti hadover tzarech im. The meharambam v'tur shulchan aruch, umitamid Rabbeinu Yoina muchach, the ein birchas ha'ikar poiter es rak hatofel, v'loy hatofel hatofel. What does the Teres Chaim see in the case of the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam? What's the diuk? So the Teres Chaim makes a remarkable diuk in the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch. If we look in the Ikar din of Moliach and Tchila and Pas Imoy, where this is paskened in Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Reish Yud Beis Sif Aleph, the Shulchan Aruch brings, and the Lashon of Shulchan Aruch is almost identical to the Lashon of the Rambam, and the Teres Chaim says that the Shulchan Aruch is essentially bimatik the Lashon of the Rambam with a minor shinui. The Shulchan Aruch says in the beginning of Siman Reish Yud Beis, Kol shu ikar v'imoy tfeila, mevarech ala ikaru poiter es hatfeila. Says the Mechaber, v'afilu pas shu choshev mikoil. Like Tosfos says, the illustration of the mission of Ikar and Tofel is to emphasize that even pas, there are instances that it could be a Tofel. Imhu Tofel k'oyikoin she'oichel dag moliach v'oichel pas imoy kedei shelo yazikenu b'groinoi mevorech ala dag u'poiter es hapas kevon shehu Tofel. Zok the Teres Chaim earlier in the same piece, in the beginning of Sivkot and Gimel, he says that if we're medayik in the lashon of the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, we will see the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say that the reason why he's eating moliach is because beforehand he ate Peiros ginoisar, which require the eating of a davar moliach, and in that case the pas is tofel to the davar moliach. So the Teres Chaim, the case is he simply wants to eat dag moliach. Mivarech al dag moliach, and therefore he's making the bracha on the dag moliach. And in that case, the Zok the Teres Chaim, v'lo hiskiru Rambam v'tur Shulchan Aruch klau she'oichel peiros. They didn't mention that prior to the achil of Moliach, he ate peiros. La'afuke, they are coming clearly to argue, mishitas ha'toisvos, shehikshu amai einim mevarach ala peiros v'yifta Moliach es hapas. The Shulchan Aruch is avoiding the kasha of Tosfos that if the sequence begins with achilas ha'peiros, so make a bracha on peiros. And Tosfos' only answer to that is that a certain ukimta, that there isn't the ability to apply the rules of Ikar and Tofel because it wasn't Lefanov, it wasn't Ba'isei Mokim. But where we come to Paskin, the straightforward case of eating Moliach and then eating Pas, the Tur Shulchan Aruch would have to illustrate that in a case where the Peiros Ginoisa had preceded the sequence, then in that case the Peiros Ginoisa would pater everything. But yet the Tur Shulchan Aruch simply illustrate the case like the Mishnah of Eviu Lefanov Tchila, Maliach Tchila, Bupas, Mevarach ala Maliach, and it's point to the Pas. Vice the Chois, in that case, the HaBracha of the Peiros won't be able to point to the Pas. Why? The Heim Soivrims of the Teres Chaim, the Tur Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam hold, the Hod the Ikar Poiter es HaTofel, Hu Rak HaTofel Loi. It's only where it's directly tofel one to the other. Therefore, again, Zok the Teres Chaim, from the way the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam bring the Gemara, the tfeilus is between Moliach and Pas, but the bracha on the Peiros won't be able to pater the Pas. Now, we obviously have to supplement this with an additional hezbollah. The Teres Chaim has told us that the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam illustrate the Mishnah kipshuta. Kigoin she'oichel dag moliach v'oichel pas imoy kedei shelo yaziken. But that lechura is connected the Gemara. The Gemara asked, how is pas tofel to moliach? And the Gemara said, b'peiros ginoisar. So far we know three explanations in that Gemara. Tosfos says, peiros ginoisar is ikar, the moliach is tofel to the peiros, the pas is tofel to the moliach. Rashi says the pas is tofel directly to the peiros because the peiros ginoisar are muchashuv. Rabbeinu Yonah says the pas is tofel to the peiros ginoisar because the peiros ginoisar are eaten with melach, and the pas is tofel to the peiros because the achilas hapeiros requires pas. The Tur Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam don't seem to bring down the ukimta of the Gemara of a peiros ginoisar shanu. They simply illustrate the case where he's being oichel moliach and the pas is imoy. How then is the pas tofel to the moliach? Zot the Teres Chaim b'toich dvarov a dovar nifla, that if we look in the Pirush Mishnayos LaRambam, the Pirush Mishnayos LaRambam says that ba'oichle peiros ginoisar is simply establishing why the person is eating a moliach such that pas is tofel to the moliach. Where do we find that someone will eat a moliach and seemingly his ikar achila will be the moliach and not the pas? Simply, what's the metzius? Zot the Rambam, the metzius is that previously he ate peiros ginoisa. Why doesn't the moliach become tofel to the peiros ginoisa and the pas in turn become tofel to the peiros? Zok the Teres Chaim, that since the achila of the moliach is only to settle the stomach, in the way the Teres Chaim explains, we'll see the Lashon in a moment, after the achila of the peiros. So therefore the moliach doesn't become tofel to the achilas hapeiros, but since the moliach is only a nechal kedei to be shoyer the itztumka after the achila of the peiros, the pas remains a tofel. If we go back to the Teres Chaim, he quotes the Pirush Mishnayos LaRambam. He says, Uba Pirush Mishnayos kosav, the divrei ha-mishnah einu ela b'shoimrei ginois, we're talking about those that watch orchards, shem oichlin peiros b'sachlis misikusam, they eat peiros at their most intense sweetness, ubishvil kach oisim mach ha-moliach k'dei lechatei HaHilchos ha-mizdabekes ha-nikbotzois b'tztumka. It's in order to settle the stomach after the eating of something so strongly sweet. And the moliach alone can't be eaten. Says the Teres Chaim, how does the Rambam, and therefore by extension Shulchan Aruch, understand in the Gemara? Pirush, Meicheteise, where does the Mishnah see that there's such an instance? Why is he eating something so intensely salty? The answer is that he has to eat a dover maluach as a result of eating a dover mosaik. And therefore the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam don't need to mention at all that what preceded the sequence is peiros, because the peiros are irrelevant. The peiros is just a mitziastic ukimta. It's just to establish the practical case of why the person is eating something that's so moliach. But the fact that he ate something so moliach as a result of eating peiros previously doesn't in any way affect the sequence of ikar and tafel. So let's summarize the Shittas HaRishonim that we've seen so far, and then once again clarify what the Teres Chaim sees in the Shita of the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam. We began with a Mishnah that the Mishnah establishes a case where pas can be tofel to a moliach. The Gemara asked, what is the instance in which the moliach becomes ikar and the pas is tofel? The Gemara answers, peiros ginoisa. Tosfos understands the peiros are the ikar. Moliach is tofel to the peiros. The pas should then be tofel to the moliach, which is in turn tofel to the pas. Therefore, in terms of the halachas or the brachas of ikar and tofel, a bracha will be made on the pas, and in that case, everything else would be tofel. A bracha will be made on the peiros, and everything else would be tofel to the pas. Therefore, Tosfos asks, why is a bracha being made on the moliach? Tosfos says that the reason is because in the klalim of ikar and tofel, the moliach together with the pas are not tofel to the peiros, either because it's not ba'isei ma'imod or because it wasn't there. That's Shittas HaTosfos, from which we saw the Magen Avraham derives a klal in ikar and tofel, that tofel to a tofel is potter. And therefore the Magen Avraham goes on to say that mashkim haboim b'soich hasudal, that a potter idea, the birchas halechem, the anusi that is consumed in order to be able to mematik the pas, would be included in the bracha of the pas. The Teres Chaim is medayik that Rashi didn't understand the Gemara like Tosfos. Rashi understood that the way the pas is potter is because the case is that the peiros ginoisa themselves are choshev min pas, and therefore the bracha of the peiros ginoisa is including the bracha of the pas. So to Rabbeinu Yona's mavur that the pas becomes tofel to the peiros ginoisa because the peiros ginoisa are nechal im lechem harbe, and therefore the bracha of the pas becomes tofel to the peiros, not like Rashi says because it's choshev, because it's a tzorech of the achilas hapeiros. The Teres Chaim is medayik in the lashon of the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch that they don't mention achilas hapeiros at all. L'chura, the Gemara required achilas hapeiros, either lefi Tosfos because be'etzem achilas hapeiros would be poiter the moliach and the pas, or according to Rashi because the peiros are choshev yosem and a pas, according to Rabbeinu Yonah because the pas is directly tofel to the pas is directly tofel to the peiros. So how can the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch not mention achilas hapas b'chlal? Zok the Teres Chaim al Karchoch, the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam learned the Gemara differently. The Gemara was asking simply a question in Metzius. What is the case where a person would be eating a moliach which was so intense that it would require achilas hapas? And the answer is that the person previously had eaten peiros ginoisar, but that's simply a metzius. But we don't require the achilas hapeiros like Rashi and Rabbeinu Yonah to establish ikar and tofel. And nor, says the Teres Chaim, would the achilas hapeiros in any way change the din of the bracha. The hainu, even in a case where peiros would be nechal, still the pas would never become tofel to the achilas hapeiros. Vais Techoy, says the Teres Chaim, that the Shulchan Aruch argues on the din of Tosfos, and a tofel to a tofel would never be potter. Because were a tofel to a tofel be potter, then the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam would have to include the case of the Gemara of peiros ginoisar, because in that case where peiros ginoisar would be eaten, then the moliach and in turn the pas would become potter to the peres ginoisa. Elomai, if we see the peres ginoisa is irrelevant, then the only ikar and tofel relationship is between the moliach and the pas, and in that case we see that the Shulchan Aruch argues on the din of tofel to tofel. And therefore, Zok the Teres Chaim, Ledina, there's a mokum to be mistapik in the halacha of the Magen Avram, because the stima of the Rambam and by extension the Shulchan Aruch seems to be mevur deloi ka ha-Magen Avram. Ledina. The Mishnah Berurah in Siman Reish Yud Beis is matik the din of the Magen Avram. In Siman Reish Yud Beis Sifkot and Daled, the Magen Avram, the Mishnah Berurah is matik the din of the Magen Avram, and he says, "Ha'anusi she'oichlen achar asuda lematik shtiyas yain sheshosam mikoydem in tzorich levarach aleim dem tfeilim lahayayin ubrichas hayayin poitzrosam." That's the straightforward din of the Magen Avram. I'm sorry, the straightforward din of the Shilta Giborim, and that din is pashut, that the yain is ikir, and the anusi is tofel. Firtois the Mishnah Berurah v'hu adin kisheshasa shar mashkin toich hasuda v'oichel achar kach anusi lematik hashtia ein tzorich bracha mishum de birchas alechem poitrosam v'hamashke tofel alechem v'anusi lamashke. So lehalacha, the Mishnah Berurah is paskening like the Magen Avram that a tofel to a tofel is potter from a bracha. Now, the precise case of mashkim and anusi is not a common seer biyomenu. However, the Bir Halacha and Siman Kuf Ayin Daled illustrates the din of the Magen Avram in a more practical case, le'inyoneinu. The Bir Halacha is in Siman Kuf Ayin Daled Sif Beis Dibra Maskal Yain Poiter Kol Shar Mini Mashkin. Zok the Bir Halacha lefize hashoise kava achashtias hayayin. Someone who was drinking a coffee after they drank wine in tzarich levarach alav. That's a straightforward din. Coffee is shar mashkim. He was mevarach ala yayin. The din is that yayin is poiter shar mini mashkim. Zok the Bir Halacha va'af al hatzuker shenoitel befiv lematik kashtia gam kein ein tzarich levarach duhu nitfa lahakava v'hakava lahayayin. Zok the Bir Halacha, and this, says the Bir Halacha, is based on a Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, and we'll see in a moment that the Chasam Sofer himself is based on the Magen Avram. That based on the Magen Avram, that a tofel to a tofel also has a din of ikar and tofel. So therefore, the sugar, which is nital befiv, lematik hashtia, ein tzarich levarich, because it's nitfa la'akave v'akave layayin. Now, there is a chidush in this Bir Halacha, which we will emphasize and point out b'siyata d'shmaya when we see the Tshuvas Chasam Sofer inside. But the Chasam Sofer's din seems to be a direct application of the din of the Magen Avram. That a tofel to a tofel is potter. In this case, the kava is tofel to the yayin, the zucker is tofel to the kaf. Now, it's important to emphasize, just in Ladina, that the discussion of the Mishnah Berurah of zucker and kava is talking about where the sugar is cubed. And there, the sugar was taken in the mouth before the coffee was drunk, and some of the sugar was nibbled to sweeten the mouth, and then the coffee was then subsequently drunk, and that the sugar that was already in the mouth then sweetened the subsequent coffee. Luyet suyer, the sugar was actually mixed into the coffee rather than being consumed by itself. In the lashon of the Bir Halacha, that was nitan befiv, to be mamtik the shtia. What would be the din? What would be the din in that case? So we find a fascinating discussion in the Poskei Zmanenu. What would be the din in a case of sugar which was mixed into a drink, in the case where the dinim of ikar and tofel weren't satisfied? For example, we saw in Tosfos that if the tofel wasn't befonov, then the bracha on the ikar isn't paid to the tofel when the tofel is subsequently brought. That was the second answer of Tosfos, why the bracha on the Peres Ginoisa doesn't in turn pater the Maliach, which in turn should pater the Pas. Tosfos said, Lo Yehoya Shama Dayin Maliach Hu Pas. Why? Tosfos says, the Lo Yodea Shi Cholish Libe Machmas HaMesikus. So what would be in a case where someone made themselves a coffee and there wasn't any sugar in front of him, and his intention was to have the coffee without the sugar, like Tosfos says, Lo Yodea, and then afterwards sugar was brought. Tzir, that is often asked halacha l'maisa, this medrash shadow that comes up frequently, that people came to make coffee, the sugar supply had run out, people made their coffees and made a bracha, and afterwards someone comes and replenishes the sugar supply, and people now want to take and mix it into their coffee. What's the din b'negea to Ikar and Tofel? So in Shmir Shabbos HILCHOS, the Rishaya Noivert brings in the name of Reb Shlomo Zalman, and this takes us back to one of the basic principles of Birchas Hanenin. Reb Shlomo Zalman said, l'chura, we should say that the sugar is completely bottled. It should be bottled. It should be bottled b'roiv. We can discuss l'chura that since it's avidila taima, the sugar shouldn't be bottled. Shlomo Zalman is done mitzad the dinim of bittul. So Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, Harry, one side of the Gemara in the beginning of the parak is that the mechayev of Birchas Hanenin is like gezel and mi'ilah. Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, Harry, the klal is that mammon is not bottled. The sugi in mi'ilah, mammon is not bottled. So Ibazoi, we can't use a simple principle of bittul to be able to be poiter a dover hamu'uruv from a bracha rishayna. And therefore, Reb Shlomo Zalman was mitzaded that we should still require the dinim of Ikar and Tofel, in which case it's mechuyev in a bracha. L'umas that we find that Ramosha in Tshuva, in the Teich Dvarav in the Tshuva in Yeridea, in Chelik Dalad in Simon Memches Ois Hei, the Ramosha takes a different mahalach in this shaila, and he says you certainly do not need to make a bracha on sugar. And so too other poskim take a similar position, that in this case where it becomes nis'ariv and it's legamri bottle, it's not nikar, it becomes a chelik of entirely a chelik of the ikar. In that case, it's poshut that there's no din to be mevarech on the sugar that was mixed in. This is the din that qualifies the halacha of the Bir halacha, that kipshuta, according to many achronim, the tzir of the zucker would only be zucker shenoita lepiv in the way that was done traditionally with sugar cubes. But where it would be me'urev, seemingly the haskama of the achronim is to be mitzaded the loiker Shlomo Zalman, that la'olam, once it's mixed in, we don't have the shaila. So the case of the Bir halacha would be limited to being noita zucker bifiv. But zot the Bir halacha, lefi the klal of the Magen Avram, that would be potter mitzad the din of a tofel, mitzad the din of a tofel to a tofel. Vos state in Tshuvas Chasam Sofer. Mitoich dvarav will be oimed on number of nekudas in the sugya of Ikar and Tofel, and as we mentioned, this will then bring us back to the sugya of dvar maboim b'soichas suda, and be mashlim a nekuda that we had left from the previous limud. The Tshuvas Chasam Sofer is done similarly to be mitzaded that perhaps the din of the Magen Avram, like the Teres Chaim said, is shonri in a machlokes harishonim, and he brings a fascinating raya to the cholkim on the Magen, or the possibility to be cholek on the Magen Avram, and his din is from a Tosfos in Arvei Psachim. We have a machlokes harishonim b'negea to the bracha that needs to be made on moror, that's eaten after the achila of matzah. So there are rishonim who hold that the moror is considered dvar maboim b'toich hasuda and is included in the bracha of hamaitzi. there are Rishonim that say that the bracha is included in the bracha of Bar Pri Adama that's made on the HaRav, on the Shar HaRav of Karpas. That's one noisei in the Rishonim. Then there's a second noisei in the Rishonim, where there are Rishonim that hold that the Tibul Rishon, what we call Karpas, is done in Charoises. So Zod the Chasam Sofer, there is a hechrech to those Rishonim that hold that the Tibul Rishon of Karpas needs to be in Charoises. What's the hechrech? So Zod the Chasam Sofer, he says, L'shitas HaRav Rabbi Yosef v'Rashi v'Rabbeinu Shmaya, the Maisi HaTosfos, l'chayiv Tibul Rishon b'Charoises, that the first Tibul should be in Charoises. Zod the Chasam Sofer, why should that be? Nearly, l'fi ma shekosu HaTosfos l'kamon. What Tosfos says later on in our Pesachim, Shitas Harita, that's Rabbi Yosef Tov Elim. The Svirle de Boyer Pri Adama, the Shar HaRav Poiter as Amoror. The reason why we don't make a Boyer Pri Adama on Moror is not because it's Dvar Maboy B'Seich HaSuda, but because it's included in the Boyer Pri Adama of Karpas. Frek the Chasam Sofer v'koshe Charoises mi Patra. Hare the charoises that's eaten with the moror, what bracha is being made for the charoises? Elomai, you'll say it's a tofel to the moror. So Zot the Chasam Sofer, Bishloima im mevarech al hamoror bar pri adama. If we would make on the moror its own bar pri adama, which is not the way we are noyeg ladina, so then havele mevarech ala ikuru poiter sacharoises atofel. Then the charoises would be a tofel. Aval imoror gufei nifter mishar HaRav, if the moror itself is only included in the bracha of the karpas, so therefore the charoises now becomes a tofel to the moror, which in turn is only potter from a bracha because of the karpas. So therefore, says the Chasam Sofer, the charoises of the moror cannot be potter by virtue of being a tofel to the moror, which is in turn only included in the bracha of something else. Mimele, the Rishonim say that you have to make a bracha on the achila of the HaRav of karpas. So by virtue of eating charoises together with that karpas, the charoises is included in the bracha of the karpas. So therefore, all the charoises that you'll eat subsequently, not just the charoises with the karpas, but the charoises that you'll eat with the moror later, is included in the bracha of the first charoises, which is included in the bracha on the karpas. He says, "Ilav dave metabel gam shari rokas becharoises loy have a potter as a charoises she'im hamor." If we would not make it would not be oichel charoises together with the first karpas, so then the only oifen of being poiter the charoises would be as a tofel to the moror. Hare, the moror itself doesn't have its own bracha; it's only included in the bracha of the karpas. The bracha of the karpas can't include moror and its charoises. But where we're oichel charoises together with the karpas, then the bracha of the karpas includes charoises, and that will include the charoises that's neichal in the moror. So Zod the Chasam Sofer, the hechrach of Rabbi Yosef, Rashi, and Rabbeinu Shmaya, that the Tibul Rishon, what we call karpas, should be with charoises, is because if it wouldn't be with charoises, then the moror, which certainly requires charoises, the charoises would require its own bracha. Zok the Chasam Sofer, therefore, by being mavarech on the karpas and including in that charoises, that's poiter the charoises of later. As is mavur in Shuvas Chasam Sofer. Ze hanil enuzdaiti b'shita hanal. Frek the Chasam Sofer, but oi bazoi, it's connected the Magen Avram. Harei a tofel to a tofel, according to the Magen Avram, is potter. Now, before we see how the Chasam Sofer is miyashav the Magen Avram to this thesis, l'chera we have to pause for a moment and be matmiya on the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer comparison between Mor to Charoises, where the Mor is Potter al Yidei Karpas, to compare that to Tofel, L'chura is Tomua Ma'oid. Hare, in the case of the Chasam Sofer, where a bracha is being made on Karpas, which in turn is poiter the Mor. The Mor which is eaten, by virtue of the fact that it's included in the bracha of the Karpas, is not midin Ikar and Tofel. It's midin that whenever a person is oichel shnei minim, that have a bracha achas, he's mevorach bracha achas and koil both of them. So when according to those Rishonim, that Mor doesn't have its own bracha, but is included in the bracha of the Karpas, that's not to do with the din of Ikar and Tofel. That's because simply one bracha is koil shnei mini yerakas. It's koil the yerak of Karpas and it's koil Mor. So it's as though a specific bracha was being made on the Mor, which of course is poiter the Charoises. It's only in a case where the dover ha'ikri is potter from bracha that there we have a din of Tofel to Tofel. But where a bracha is being made, how can we compare that to the case of Tofel and Tofel? It's absolutely not moving. And I found Be'ezer Hashem that the Teres Chaim, in the same piece that we learned later, brings the din of the Chasam Sofer, and he asks this kash on the Chasam Sofer. The comparison of the Chasam Sofer. But Homios, what's relevant to us is the Hemshech of the Chasam Sofer, which, as we said, will bring us back to the previous sugya of Dvar Ma'boim B'Seich HaSuda. Zot the Chasam Sofer, Shavti Ro'isi the Shlesapik B'Hom Milsatu. That perhaps the din of a Tofel to a Tofel is not relevant in this case. Why? He says, Dilma Adkan Le Ko'omri Atoisus U'Mogin Avram. Atoisus U'Mogin Avram only said the din of Ikar and Tofel Ela Begavne Didhu. Only in their case. Why? The Kol Oich Peres Ginoisar. Anyone eat Peres Ginoisar has to eat a moliach l'hafel. Umoliach enu necha b'lechem, and a moliach is always too strong to be eaten without him to offset the melicha. Nimtzo gam halechem have tofel aginoisa. B'chein b'idin mogin avrom kol ha'oichel tzorich lish. Anyone eating has to drink, but b'lishtiach anusa. A person has to then offset the Aval nofali speika beyayin poiter kol mini mashkim. Let's say in the case of yayin, which is poiter kol mini mashkim, she'ena mashkim tzrichen la yayin ela chashivos kvias yayin poiter kol mashkim im kein hashoise kafe acharkach. If someone would drink a coffee, umematkoy betzukar shebefiv, im atzukar nifta de yain she'eno tofel yain ela lakava, v'hayayin v'akava in a tzichim zelazeh. So the Chasam Sofer is svar nifla. What's the reason why a tofel to a tofel is potter from a bracha? So the Chasam Sofer, it's not because every tofel a tofel allows a sequence of tefilus, that every additional item which is tofel to what precedes it can then be tofel to what precedes it. That's not the svara. La'olam, the din is there is only one ikar and one tofel, like it's mavur in Rashi and Rabbeinu Yoina. What's the svara of Taisus and the Mogen Avraham? So the Chasam Sofer nifla. The reason why the pas becomes tofel is because be'emes the pas is tofel to the Peres Ginoisar. Why? Because every achila of Peres Ginoisar is mechayev moliach, and every moliach requires pas. So berega that a person is oichel Peres Ginoisar, that necessitates the achila of pas, and therefore the pas is tofel to the Peres Ginoisar. Masha'en ken in the tzir of the beer halacha that we saw, that someone is drinking yayin, and the yayin doesn't necessitate that shti of the kava, it's just something that he wants to do, so then the tzukar shouldn't be tofel to the kava. Zot the Chasam Sofer, if so, if we now return to the din of Tosfos shaila was, a person is being oichel morar, and then he's being oichel with that charoises. should that now say that the charoises should be potter and included in the bracha on the karpas as a tofel to the morah, which is included in the bracha of the karpas? Zod the Chasam Sofer, according to this Torah, it shouldn't be. Because when a person is oichel, the original yerek, is that mechayiv that afterwards he should eat moror and in turn eat that moror with charoises? No, there's no connection between them b'chlal. He's going to be oichel karpas. He's then going to be oichel moror. It's not one. It's not machriach the other. Memela zod the Chasam Sofer la'olam. We can hold like the yesod of the Magen Avraham that there's tofel to tofel, but only in the case of Tosfos or the Magen Avraham, where the original achila is mechayev the tofel, which is then mechayev the tofel to the tofel. But where the original achila of the ikar is not mechayev a tofel, there's no din of tofel to the tofel. Oivazoi, there'd be no stira to the Magen Avraham from the sheet of those Rishonim that hold that one has to eat charoises betibul rishon kedei that it should be potter bebracha, because otherwise it would be a tofel to a tofel. The Basoif, the Chasam Sofer, and Be'ez Hashem and Bli Neder will be mamshech the Chasam Sofer in a further limud. But the Chasam Sofer is choizer from this chiluk and says, L'dina, there is no difference if the tofel is necessary or the tofel is not mukhrach. And he'll prove it with a raya niflo from the earliest sugya of Shemen and Anigroin, which Be'ez Hashem and Bli Neder will see in the next limud. But homios, l'sikum hadvarim, what we gain from this Tshuvas Chasam Sofer is the following: that whereas Rashi is mukhrach, where Rashi says that the reason why the pas is potted from a bracha is because it's choshev min pas in a chanami. Rashi is a mavur that there is no din of tofel tofel. But Rabbeinu Yoina that says that the pas is in turn tofel to the peiros, Rabbeinu Yoina may simply mean what the Chasam Sofer says, that since the Geras Genoisa are machriach the maliach and the maliach is machriach the pas then becomes tofel. The pas then becomes tofel to the peiros Genoisa, because a tofel is in an oifen of hachrach. The stima of the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam L'chura would still remain mukshe on the Magen Avraham. So l'sikum advarim, we have four mahalchim in how to understand the Gemara of mi ikemidid av maliach ikru pas tefela, to which the Gemara answers peiros ginoisar. Tosfos says it's a sequence. Peiros ginoisar maliach pas. Rashi says the pas is tofel to the peiros ginoisar because of choshuv. Rabbeinu Yoina, when Mesupik in the Kavan of Rabbeinu Yoina says that the pas is tofel to the peiros because the pas is ne'echalim peiros. Then we have the sheet of the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam that the Gemara Bechlal isn't addressing the din of Ikar and Tofel, but the Gemara is merely saying the mitzius is that the person is being oichel something which is so maliach that's so mosik that's in mechayev maliach, but there's never a tefilus between the maliach and the maliach and the pas. And then we saw the suffix of the nifla of the Chasam Sofer in the svara of Tofel Tofel. Is there a general svara that the sequence of tefilus can continue? Or is there a svara that the tofel is because the original achil of the ikar is mechayev the tofel to the tofel? And the nafkamina was in the case of sugar, which is drunk as part of the sequence of the achila of kava, which is only a tofel to yayin, but the yayin doesn't necessitate the shtia of the kava. To conclude with brief divrei Agadah, yesterday was the Yom of Tes Tammuz. Tes Tammuz is mavur in the Gemara, and it's a header like that. Ba'irach in the Yerushalmi was Bizman Bayis Mikdash Rishon. Bizman Mikdash Rishon was the Zman of Hufka Ha'ir, the Yom in which the Chaymas of Yerushalayim were Nivka. Churban Bayis Sheni becomes the Ikar Avelus, and therefore the Yom is Nikva, Alpi the Bekia of the ear in Bayis Sheni. Machtz HaShekel says that Ladina, since the Churban of Bayis Sheni remains entirely the Ikar, there isn't even a mokum for a Baal Nefesh to be machmir, to be mis'ane on Tes, although in the Tchilas Hadvarim of the Machtz HaShekel, he is mitzaded possibly that a Baal Nefesh should be machmir, to be mis'ane on Tes, because of the Churban in the Bekiya Sa'ir, in Bayis Rishon. The Basoif, as we mentioned, the Machtz HaShekel's maskana is that even a Baal Nefesh is not machmir to be mis'ane on the chi, because Churban Basheni is IKAR, and Memela the Kvius remain that the Tainus is only related to Yud Zayin B'Tammuz and is not related to the din of Bayis Rishon and the chi. That's the maskana of the Machzas HaShekel. So perhaps to be oimed on what the chashivus, the significance of the bikia of the ear is, the concept that the choimos themselves were nivka. What's the significance and what's the tragedy in the bikia of the choimos? Kipshutai, the Svaras Hadvarim is that in the kedusha of Gimel Machanos that we learn, what we have in the parashas of Sefer Bamidbar, Machne Shechina surrounding that Machne Levia and surrounding that Machne Yisrael. The Makam Mishkan was Machne Shechina. Surrounding that was the Machne of the Levium, and surrounding that Yud Beis Mil was Machne Yisrael. Machne Yisrael has a kedusha. Mitzayroim an ishtalei chutz lamachne, Satan Tmeim an ishtalei chutz lamachne. Machne Yisrael has a kedusha. We have that even in before Machnes were formally established by Nezanev b'chokal and echsholem acharecha, the concept of poltosay ha'onam, that those that weren't on the darga to be included within the mokum where Klal Yisrael was, were rejected. To be able to be meshach shayche to even the mokum of Machne Yisrael, which is a din of kedusha, is defined by the parameters, by the boundaries of Machne Yisrael. All Botei Ori Chayma in Eretz Yisrael, now there Moisi Shua ben Nun, similarly have a kedusha of Machne Yisrael, and Machne Yisrael has dinim. Kachim Kalimah nechalim b'Machne Yisrael. Ma'aser Sheni is nechal Teichayim Yerushalayim. Machne Yisrael is mechayev a kedusha, which is not necessarily unique to Yerushalayim, although Ma'aser Sheni is, but is by other instances of Botei Ori Chayma. Also, the Mishnah says, Kachim Kalimah nechalim b'Seicham, which raises a fascinating diyun in the Achronim. How is it possible that Kachim Kalim could be nechal in Botei Ori Chayma? Harei Kachim Kalim can only be nishchat in the Mikdash, and once Kachim Kalim are yotzim chutz Yerushalayim, they are nifsalim b'yotzei. So how could they ever be in one of the other Botei Ori Chayma such that they could be nechal? There's extensive discussion about that din in the Achronim. Menachem Zemba in the Psicha to his Sefer on Sifri is marich on this shaila and other Achronim. But a whole meals, Machne Yisrael has a kedusha. Those who were shoichen toicha machne were shvatim. Mevur in the Ramban and the Gra similarly says this, that the Erev who didn't have mokum toicha shvatim were shoichen chutz lamachne. They weren't part of the kedusha of Yud Beis Mil al Yud Beis Mil. Parshas Sefer Bamidbar that we're Oisik now begins with each one of the members of the Shvatim being Mesiachas l'Shivteim, and only that being given a specific Mokum Chanoya. Matoivoy Alecha Yaakov Mishkanoi Secha Yisrael. We'll see in this week's parasha in Chukas Bolok, the kedusha of Machne Yisrael was established the Mokum Chanoya, and it didn't just establish a Mokum Chanoya and kedushas Machnes b'negei to dinim. It established the mokum of Ashras Hashchina. That the Rebbeinu Shalom grants Klal Yisrael b'shochanti b'soicham doesn't just mean that Shechina is shoyra b'soicham only in the Makam HaMishkan, but Shechina is shoyra to some degree in the entire Machne. That's the kedusha of Machne Yisrael, that Shechina is b'soicham. The concept that the choimos of Yerushalayim were nivka, in the Lashon of the Novi, Kiloi Hemin Ki Yovoy Tsar V'Oyev B'Share Yerushalayim. Klal Yisrael wasn't maimin that the Oyev would even be able to penetrate the Sha'arim of Yerushalayim. The Share Yerushalayim represents the Kedusha of Machne Yisrael. The concept that the Choimos around it represents the barrier to separate the Kedusha Samachne to the Mokum which is called Michutz Lamachne, which is a Mokum of Tmeim. The tsar, the tzara of ki yavoi tsar va'oyev b'shari Yerushalayim is the concept that the kedusha of Machne Yisrael, Knire, was decimated to the extent that then the Tsar and Oyev could enter Shari Yerushalayim. The Bir Hadvarim is, al pi what's mevur nefesh hachaim, that when Titus came to be machriv the Mikdash, so they said to him, the lashon that the nefesh hachaim brings is kamchot chino katochnis. You're coming to grind flour which has already been ground. Dahainu, the only way in which Titus was able to be machriv the Nova was because Shechina was already nistalic. Once Shechina was nistalic, then Titus could chas v'shalom be machriv. We can perhaps suggest that in the same way as an nefesh hachaim is mavur, that any mokim that be'etzem mitzad kedushos would exclude a goy. Hare, it's mavur in the Mishnayos and Maseches Kelim that a goy can't be nichnas min a chilul min a soyreg lifnim, and ilula Shechina was nistalic, a goy wouldn't be able to penetrate and be oimed in that mokum. So too, if the kedusha of Machne Yisrael is designated for shvatim miyuchasim, memela be'etzem ki lo yehemin ki yavoi tsar v'oyev b'shari Yerushalayim. If the Ummah Ha'olam could penetrate the Chaymos Yerushalayim, al-Karcha, it was nostalgic from the Machne Yisrael, some of its vestiges of Kedusha. And only after it was nostalgic from Machne Yisrael, some of its vestiges of Kedusha, could then the Oyev be Oymed B'Shari Yerushalayim. Vais Techois, the tzara of the Oyev being B'Shari Yerushalayim is if the Oyev had the koyach to be Boikeya the Chaymos. It must be that was preceded by the fact that in some way the Kedusha of Machne Yisrael was compromised. The Briche Sha'orayich, the Beirach Bonayich Bekirbeich that the Shari Yerushalayim and the Chaymos Yerushalayim represent was somehow compromised and diluted. And as a result of that, the Oyev was able to be Bekeya. Hare the Rambam is Mavur in Perek Hey of HILCHOS Tainus, that the Ikim Mator of the Chamisha Taniyos is as a zman of tshuva to be misboinen what the siba of the churban was and be mesakim. Lidvarenu, the shoyrish of the bekia of the Chaymos was because in some way Kedushas Machne Yisrael was decimated and reduced and nostalgic, and al yedei that there was also kam chatrinot katachnis relative to the darga of Machne Yisrael, similar to that the Nefesh HaChaim establishes in Titus's Churban of Mikdash. Therefore, the hisboinenus of the Yomim of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is to be misboinen in what Kedushas HaMachne requires. V'hoyo machanecha kodesh v'lo yiroi b'cho ervas dover v'shav l'acharecha. All that Kedushas Yisrael is mechayev kedei that there should be Kedushas Machne Yisrael. That's the Sheirish Hadavar Alidei. That it was Chatam that Ummah Ha'olam were able to be Oymed B'Shari Yerushalayim. It was Nisbatal Oymdos Hoyu Ragleinu B'Sharayich Yerushalayim Alidei that it was Hufka Ha'ir. This is the Avelus which is Shaykh to the Yom Tes. It's the Avelus which is Shaykh to Yom Yud Zayin. But the Rambam says the Ikem HaTorah is not just an Avelus Yishama, but to be Mizvoinen in the Sheirish of Churban and Be'ezer Hashem to be Mekabel, and to be Isaac in the tikkun of what the Churban it represents and what caused it, and therefore what we are able to be Isaac in order to be able to the Basoif be Mevi Goyal, the man Shmoi Ba'ava.